Good afternoon. Welcome to the second part of our journey in the North African Operation Theater, where the Umayyad Caliphate, the Roman Empire, and the Berber chiefs fought for several decades of the 7th century. It was a political and military confrontation with far-reaching consequences in space and time. In the last lecture, we have seen the expedition of Uqba bin Nafir. As if driven by an irresistible force, he had covered in about 3 years the distance from Damascus to the Atlantic Ocean, about half of it in territories that no Arab had ever explored, often fighting its way through and trying to spread his religion among people that had never heard about it. The rapidity with which those distances were covered astonishes us, but we have to bear in mind two considerations. The first is that the desert was for the Arabs like the sea and the rivers for the Vikings. It made their advance through hostile territories easier instead of hindering it. The second consideration concerns the geography of North Africa. There, all mountain ranges, from the Ores to the highlands of Kabylia to the Atlas, run along the east-west axis. They constitute natural barriers for invaders who landed on the Mediterranean shore of Africa, such as the ancient Romans, the Byzantines, and many centuries later the French, but not for invaders who moved along the coast, such as the Vandals, who came from the west, or the Arabs who came from the east. Anyway, as we have seen last time, on his way back from the Maghreb, Uqba bin Nafir had found, waiting for him, Kusila, king of a large confederation of Berber tribes. 2 years before, Uqba had cast him in chains and dragged him like a living trophy on his way to the Maghreb until Kusila had managed to escape. While Uqba was rushing forward to the Atlantic Ocean, Kusila had reestablished his old alliance with the Byzantines and assembled an army. In 683, he surprised Uqba on his way back in a location south of the Ores Mountains and killed him with almost all his followers. Then Kusila occupied the Arab garrison city in Ifriqiya, Al-Qayrawan, while the Arabs retreated to the distant city of Barca in Cyrenaica. After that, Kusila reigned for a few years on a very large area, ranging from western Libya to Morocco. He ruled wisely and with moderation, as Muslim historiographer later recognized. A few years later, the Caliph Abd al-Malik managed to send a new military expedition to Ifriqiya. Led by the austere general Zuhair bin Qais, a veteran of the Uqba campaigns, his army was not a particularly strong one. It probably consisted of some 4,000 Arabs and 2,000 Berbers. With these troops, Zuhair headed for Al-Qayrawan, now the residence of Kusila. Since the city was still devoid of fortification, the Berber king retreated towards the Ores Mountains before the arrival of the enemy. Between 686 and 688, a pitched battle was engaged in a place called Mims between Al-Qayrawan and the Ores range. The Arabs prevailed, although it was probably not an overwhelming victory. Still, it was a major success for the Arabs because Kusila, the champion of the Berber resistance, fell in the battle. Meanwhile, in Sicily, the Byzantines had organized a naval expedition against Barca, a city that had been already for 50 years in Arab hands. Barca in Cyrenaica had been fortified, but it had been left with few defenders due to the ongoing campaign against the Berber. Thus, in 689, the Byzantine marines retook the ancient Greek city, and Zuhair was forced to return hastily to Cyrenaica. He attacked the city with great determination and managed to break in, but then fell in the combat inside the city, after which his troops were defeated. In spite of the death of Kusila, the new Arab expedition had achieved nothing. With the loss of Barca, the Caliphate's situation in the African continent was back to where it had been 50 years before. The conquest of Ifriqiya had to start again from scratch. In the meantime, the internal situation of the Caliphate had been improving. Caliph Abd al-Malik was a strong and effective leader, and he had managed to choke the internal rebellion mentioned in the last lecture. In the year 692, his rival Abdallah bin as-Subayr, by then left without followers, was eventually killed. It should be borne in mind that every caliph, whom the Muslims normally call Al-Amir al-Mu'minin, meaning the commander of the faithful, had, among others, the religious duty to regain any territories lost by Islam. It was therefore time to reconquer North Africa, this time with adequate forces. In 692, Abd al-Malik selected for this task Hassan bin an-Numan al-Ghassani. Hassan was a strategist, not purely a military commander. He prepared carefully the expedition, putting together an army of 40,000 men, the largest ever sent to Africa. In the meantime, after the death of Kusila, the Berbers had found a new guide. As Procopius had reported 150 years before, the ancient Berbers religion attributed to its priestesses the power to divine the future. And precisely one of those prophetesses, named Dahia or Dihia, had taken the place of Kusila as the head of the Berber tribes. The information we have about this unique figure, which somehow reminds us of Boudica and Zenobia, has unfortunately not been provided by contemporary sources. One of our sources is the Moroccan historiographer Ibn Idari, born in the 13th century, author of the extraordinary story of the Maghrib and of the kings of Spain, also known as Al-Bayan, the history. Another one is the famous Ibn Khaldun, one of the great thinkers of the Middle Ages. He was born in Tunisia in the 14th century and is the author of the Kitab al-Ibar, the book of the teachings. As it seems, Dihia belonged to the Berber tribe of the Jarawa, which, according to Ibn Khaldun, was native of the Ores area and had been converted to Judaism in ancient times. She was already aged when she replaced Kusila at the head of the Confederation of Tribes. The story goes that she had been married to a Greek many years before. According to some, this man was a Greek local despot, and she had married him because she could then kill him and free his people. She had taken part in the battle in which Uqba bin Nafi had died, and the Berbers believed that she could foretell the future. The Arabs knew her as the Queen of the Berbers, or as Al-Kahina, that is, in their language, the prophetess, the seer. The stronghold of Dihia was in the Ores mountain, native territory of the Jarawas. The Ores is a range of mountains only about 100 kilometers long from east to west. To the north of it, there are the islands and then the coast of eastern Algeria. To the south of it is the desert, dominating the roads and the trails that connected Ifriqiya to the Maghreb. The Ores Massif was the ideal place to carry out surprise attacks, such as the one that had costed the life of Uqba bin Nafi. The Ores Mountains reach the maximum height of about 2,300 meters, but they are rugged and wild, with deep valleys and remote villages, ideal for hiding or for staging an ambush. They had been already the bulwark of the Berber resistance against the Romans, the Vandals, and the Byzantines, and they would play again an important role in the Algerian Liberation War in the 20th century. In conclusion, Hassan bin al-Numan had to confront two very different enemies: the Berber army, elusive and mobile in vast and dangerous territories, and the Byzantine forces, fortified but few and isolated. Hassan decided to start his campaign by attacking the Byzantines where they were stronger. In 693-94, he arrived with his army in front of Carthage. The city had been already twice in its history the largest port of the Mediterranean, and was by then only the shadow of itself. The imposing Roman buildings, left without maintenance for about 4 centuries, were in ruins. The magnificent artificial port built by the Carthaginians, unusable, although the city had another port. Already a few years before, the Byzantines had practically abandoned the rest of the province of Africa, impossible to defend. Therefore, the sea no longer offered prospects of trade, but only of supply for the city, or of a final escape of its residents. There were a few clashes outside the city, in which the Arab forces had the upper hand. At this point, for fear of looting and enslavement, the inhabitants who could afford it left the city by sea, after loading what they could on the ships. Hassan entered the city without the need of an assault, which saved the city from major damages. Then he headed quickly toward the Ores to face his other most dangerous enemy, the Kahina. In the meantime, the Berber queen had made her move. Her army had destroyed the ancient city of Bagai, north of the Ores Mountains, which she feared the Arabs could occupy. Her forces eventually confronted the Arabs near Miskiana, northeast of the Ores range, in a dry valley called Wadi Nini. The two armies faced each other for 1 day and 1 night without coming to battle. Then a great battle began, and towards the end of the second day, the Arabs fell back and fled. At this point, however, the Berber army kept pursuing them towards the east, killing many of them and taking many others as prisoners. It was a crushing defeat, and the first pitched battle that the Caliphate armies had lost in half a century. Hassan did not simply retreat to Al-Qayrawan, but on orders of the Caliph, he retired to Barca in Cyrenaica, completely abandoning Ifriqiya. After this defeat, for a few years the Arabs kept away from Ifriqiya. During this period, however, the Queen of the Berbers made a strategic mistake. In her already long life, she had observed how the Arab raiders were attracted by booty, which they found mainly in cities and in enemy fortresses. However, Dihia knew that the most precious assets of the Berber had always been fertile lands and pastures. She then convinced herself that the future invasions could have been avoided if only her people had renounced to the objects that attracted the Arabs, but were not indispensable for the continuation of the Berber civilization. In her view, in order to obtain peace and security, the Berbers had to abandon their cities and demolish their fortifications, so that it would make no sense to occupy them again. The Berber people had in the wild mountains and highlands of northern Africa the best possible protection from their enemies, according to her. To make a long story short, Dihia adopted a sort of preventive scorched earth policy, typical of a resistance movement that had its greatest strength in the environmental features of a territory it mastered completely. This strategy was by no means unique in history. For instance, in 1975, the Khmer Rouge, immediately after conquering the power in Cambodia, enforced a brutal transfer of the entire urban population to the countryside in order to restore the traditional agricultural civilization of the Khmer people. The Khmer Rouge regarded the inaccessible jungles of Cambodia as the best possible protection for their new state, because they had always operated in them. In contrast with the Khmer Rouge, in the case of the Kaina, there is no evidence of atrocities committed against her own people, but certainly her policy was very hard for the Berbers. Many of them, especially those who lived along the coast, had no intention to abandon their cities. It seems that many of them, desperate, sent message to the Arab commanders begging them to return. In the meantime, Hassan had received new reinforcements from the Caliph and had gathered some 12,000 Berber troops in addition. With these forces he returned to Ifriqiya for the final battle with the prophetess. It seems that Dihia made another mistake. After her victory, with a conciliatory gesture typical of Berber chiefs, she had adopted as her own son a young Arab prisoner, a guy named Khalid bin Yazid. He ended up betraying her and found a way to inform Hassan about the position and the strength of the prophetess' army. There was a first battle in which Hassan's forces defeated the Berber army. At this point, there were several defections in the Berber Confederation, while Dihia and her followers retreated into the Ores mountains to continue the fight. The final battle took place in a location north of the city of Tobna. The story goes that Dihia, like any decent seer, had anticipated her own defeat without being able to avoid it. She only succeeded in saving her two sons by advising them to join the enemy army and to adhere to Islam, which they did, so that a few years later they could participate to the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. According to some, the aged queen died in combat. According to others, she poisoned herself so as not to fall alive into enemy hands. But probably she was simply captured and beheaded in a place called since then Bir al-Kahina, that is, the well of the prophetess. Her head was sent to the caliph to prove her death. This happened probably in 698, and in any case no later than 704. For what concerns the war against the Byzantines, we have better information. In 697, the Byzantine Emperor Leontios, a former strategos of the Helladic team who had seized the power 2 years before by leading a rebellion, sent a fleet to Carthage, while Hassan was conducting his campaign against the Berbers. The Byzantine naval infantry retook the city with a surprise action, as it had happened 50 years before in Alexandria and less than 10 years before in Barca. At this point, in 698, Hassan had to arrange another assault against Carthage. This time, however, the Caliphate sent also a naval expedition to support the troops of Hassan, and in fact it managed to send a fleet larger than the Byzantine one. The admiral of the Byzantine naval squad, despairing to prevail, abandoned the fight, while Carthage fell under the assault of Hassan's army, and this time with bloodshed, fires, and significant destruction. These dramatic events marked a historic turning point, both in Constantinople and in Africa. The officers of the Byzantine naval expedition, who feared punishment for their defeat, decided to play everything for a chance. Instead of waiting for the emperor's orders, they sailed to Constantinople in revolt. The commander of the rebel fleet, who bore the Germanic name of Apsimar, landed near Constantinople and succeeded in obtaining the support of the Green faction, opposed to Leontion, whose uprising had been supported by the Blue faction a few years before. The rebels were still outside the city walls, but some guards, probably corrupted by them, let them into the city. They immediately attacked the imperial palace, captured Emperor Leontios, and dragged him into the hippodrome, where he was deposed and had his nose cut off, a treatment that, by the way, Leontios had reserved to the emperor he had himself deposed. We will talk about him in another lecture. Apsimar was acclaimed emperor and assumed the name of Tiberius III, while Leontios was locked up in a monastery. This dramatic changing of guard in the Roman Empire cancelled any hopes of retaking Carthage and of resuming military operations in Africa. The change that the fall of Carthage determined in Africa was even more important and final than that. With it, about 800 years of Roman domination came to an end in the year 698. This time the city would never recover, although Hassan did not intentionally destroy it and even built a mosque with fragments of the ancient Roman buildings. The reason why Carthage could not rise again was simply that the Arabs had already their capital for Ifriqiya. It was Al-Qayrawan, the city that they had founded, lost and retaken many times, and that had acquired for them a huge symbolic value. The Caliphate still needed a port in Ifriqiya, of course, but it created a new one a few years later in a suburb of Carthage, Tunis, where 1,000 Coptic craftsmen were transferred to this purpose. Of Carthage, only ruins remained, though still imposing ones, as the historiographer Ibn Idari documented. He reported that 6 centuries later, the inhabitants of Tunis still used to visit the ruins awed by the ancient splendor that they evoked. After the fall of Carthage and the end of the year, Hassan ruled Ifriqiya from Al-Qayrawan. The Arabs called Ifriqiya Al-Maghrib Al-Adna, that is the Near West, the territory from the Gulf of Sirte to the port of Béjaïa in eastern Algeria. They then called Al-Maghrib Al-Awsat, i.e. the Mid-Maghrib, the territory between Béjaïa and the area of Oran, close to the border with Morocco. Finally, they called the territories further west Al-Maghrib Al-Aqsa, that is the far west. All these regions together formed the so-called Al-Maghrib Al-Kabir, that is the Great Maghrib. Hassan imposed a land tax to the Europeans still present in Africa and to the Berbers who had not converted to Islam, but treated all converts as Muslim combatants in the subdivision of lands among the winners. This measure marked the beginning of a process of reconciliation with the Berbers, which will soon lead them to become, with their numbers and their military virtues, a great support for the military endeavors of the Caliphate, starting with the conquest of Spain. Hassan had not the time to carry out the normalization process he had started in Ifriqiya. He had an enemy in Abdulaziz bin Marwan, brother of the Caliph Abd al-Malik, and since 20 years, governor of Egypt. Taking advantage of the absence of Hassan, who had traveled to Damascus in 704, he replaced him with one of his men, Musa bin Nusir. Caliph Abd al-Malik, already seriously ill, died in 705 without being able to restore Hassan in his position. Therefore, the new situation was eventually ratified after the appointment of a new Caliph, Walid. Musa bin Nusir was a high-ranking official in the administration of Egypt, already over the age of 60. His first name is obviously the Arab version of Moses, who is a prophet for Islam as well. Musa was of humble origins. His father had been enslaved by the Arabs during the conquest of Syria, but he was an intelligent and energetic man and had worked his way through the Caliphate's administration, first in Syria and then in Egypt, where he worked for many years in contact with the governor Abdulaziz, who had freed his father from slavery. Musa was to become the true architect of the Islamization of North Africa, the men who bound permanently this immense region to the Muslim world by spreading the teaching of the Quran and by building countless mosques, and eventually led Arabs and Berbers to the conquest of Spain. The new governor of Ifriqiya settled in Al-Qayrawan, where he started preparations for the conquest of the Maghreb from eastern Algeria to the Atlantic coast. First, he conquered the Berber fortress of Al-Zarwan and sent his two sons to raid the Maghreb, where each of them reportedly captured the stunning figures of 100,000 prisoners, 10 of thousands of which were sent to Damascus. Then he moved westward and subdued the great Berber tribes by appointing new chiefs loyal to him. The policy adopted by the late Queen of the Berbers favored his advance, because all Berber cities had been abandoned or left without any fortifications. Some rebel tribes continued to retreat westward, but the territories they left behind were systematically colonized by the Caliphate. Eventually, Musa reached Tangier, like Uqba bin Nafi about 20 years before. Unlike his predecessors, Musa understood the immense strategic importance of the city close to the Pillars of Hercules. The city was controlled by a man called Julian. He was probably a Byzantine commander or a former Byzantine commander, and who was by then governing a Berber community and had become a vassal of the Visigoths in Iberia. Julian's stronghold was an ancient Roman outpost not far from Tangier, called Castellum ad Septem Fratres, since the times of Pomponius Mela, the Roman geographer of the 1st century AD, because of the 7 hills that surrounded the place. It was an ancient Roman fort that had subsequently become a Byzantine outpost, with the simplified name of Septem, which would later become Ceuta. By the way, after 2,000 years, the city of Ceuta is still a military outpost, currently belonging to Spain. Well, Musa conquered Tangier or negotiated with Julian the control of the city. After that, he installed there several thousands of Arabs and converted Berbers, greatly expanding the city. He ordered the Arabs to teach the Quran to the Berbers, turn many churches into mosques, and by buying from his men their younger and stronger slaves created special troops personally loyal to him. Finally, he appointed as governor of Tangier a freed slave of him, Tariq bin Ziyad, almost certainly a Berber converted to Islam. Then Musa headed southwest through the territories crossed by Uqba more than 20 years before. He reached the Sus region, crossed the Atlas, and reached the very distant Wadi Dra, establishing everywhere alliances and taking hostages in pledge before finally returning to Al-Qayrawan. After nearly 70 years after the first incursion west of Egypt, the one we mentioned in lesson 13, the Arab conquest of North Africa had been by then completed. There would be other rebellions in the future, but the power of Islam over these immense territories would never be overturned. By the year 708, Tangier had become a major military base of the Caliphate. Here was stationed the first Muslim army that would invade Spain in 711, led by Tariq bin Ziyad himself. The Pillars of Hercules would soon change their name. The mountain on the North African side of the strait would become the Jabal Musa, named after Musa bin Nusayr, while the European promontory would be called Jabal al-Tariq, that is the mountain of Tariq or Gibraltar. However, there was another major consequence of the Arab conquest of North Africa, not less relevant and threatening for Europe than the imminent Arab conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. Having learned about the past of Carthage, Musa decided to invest to make of its suburb, Tunis, then only a village, a great naval base. He ordered to create a naval yard connected to a port by a canal and secure from possible attacks by the Byzantine fleet. There he built the first group of 100 ships, to which he added the ships of an Egyptian fleet, which had landed in Tunis after they were damaged by a storm on their way back from a raid in Sardinia in 703. Thus, a great naval base had been created right in the center of the Mediterranean, in front of Sicily, a naval base which, unlike Alexandria, had access to a fundamental raw material for its yard, wood. The fleet formed in Tunisia was substantially independent from the naval forces of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a fleet devoted to piracy and to the capture of slaves, a very profitable business and useful for keeping good relations with Damascus, where 20% of the captured slaves were sent. Piracy provided quick returns. Thanks to the ransom that was rapidly obtained for some of the prisoners, which often covered the cost of the raid, while other prisoners were sold later on. Already in the early 80s of the 7th century, the Arabs had conquered the island of Pantelleria, while Sicily, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands suffered terrible raids. Accounts about those years relate of about 300,000 prisoners captured in North Africa and in the Mediterranean area. An enormous amount, possibly exaggerated figures, but in any case indicative of a catastrophe. To get an idea of the scale of the phenomenon and of the naval power that Tunis was building up, let me anticipate that when in 718 the Caliphate will launch a second offensive against Constantinople, the North African fleet alone will support it with 360 ships. In conclusion, with the Arab conquest of North Africa began for Europe the nightmare of the Saracen piracy, a phenomenon that will last for a millennium and will have enormous consequences on navigation, coastal security, and on European economy and institutions. The Mediterranean Sea, which had become a very dangerous place, ceased to be the center of the Western civilization and will instead become its border. The gravity center of Europe will move to the north, far from the Mediterranean Sea, and it will stabilize there with the Carolingians in a region between northern France and Germany, where it is still today. The European cities deprived of the trade flows from the Mediterranean will decline, and political power will be transferred from the merchant to the owners of large estates, and to their fortified residences, the castles, preparing the advent of feudalism. The triumph of the ideas of Muhammad at the end of the 7th century prepared the triumph of Charlemagne at the end of the 8th, as explained to us by Henri Pirenne. Before closing this lecture, I would like to add a little footnote to it. As said at the beginning of the last video, the Arab conquests of North Africa was a long fight, still not very well known, at least in Europe, yet it was a conflict between great powers, one of which, the Caliphate, was already controlling territories much more extended than those controlled by the ancient Roman Empire at the apogee of its power. And it was a process with lasting consequences. So, what are the reasons for this limited knowledge of the Arab conquest of Africa? One of them is that a study of this period requires the knowledge of sources in Greek, Latin, and Arabic, many of them not easily available. Another reason is that the era of the Arab conquest was not particularly rich of first-hand accounts. Let us see why. For what concerns the Byzantines, their operations in North Africa were mainly entrusted to elite troops, transported by ship and in charge for specific tasks, not to large occupation armies, as at the time of Belisarius and Procopius. In those elite units, there was no place for intellectuals like Procopius, who could later narrate the facts and reflect upon their causes and consequences. For what concerns Arabs and the Arabs and the Berber, there were other obstacles to the creation of first-hand accounts on the conquest of Africa. Firstly, their armies fought maneuver warfare and traveled daily over large distances. Even when they stopped for a few days, the men were constantly busy in exploration and supply missions in arid, uninhabited places. Very few of them had learned how to write, a time-consuming activity that requires concentration and continuity. If one passes over 2/3 of his time riding horses or camels and lives in contact with weapons and danger, he will not be able to dedicate sufficient attention to the exercise of writing. Any person engaged in physical activity or manual labor for many hours every day will know what I mean. Secondly, there was the problem of finding the materials on which to write. Finally, the Arab and Berber culture were still mainly oral cultures in which writing was confined to sacred texts or fundamental laws like Constitution of Medina. Only about a century earlier, Procopius of Caesarea had described with precision and objectivity the Byzantine military campaigns at the time of Justinian I, including the war against the Berbers. But Procopius owed his intellectual formation to the works of Herodotus and Thucydides, men that belonged to a completely different cultural context. Herodotus, Thucydides, and others had tried to leave a sign of themselves by reporting the extraordinary things that they had seen and by trying to explain the causes of the terrible events that had afflicted Greece, the wars against the Persians and the Peloponnesian War. For a 7th century Arab warrior, the problem of leaving a written trace of his own existence was much less meaningful than for an ancient Greek. His religion, abstracting the idea of God, gave him by contrast a very concrete description of the afterlife. Those who pursued the triumph of Islam would wake up as from a short sleep in a magnificent garden with streams of clean water and delicious fruits, welcomed by beautiful girls. Their lives would simply continue there indefinitely, free from any sorrow and care. This was the shared belief of the Caliphate leaders and warriors. It is true that the Caliphate had incorporated regions like Syria and Egypt where certain people were used to write, and some of them indeed wrote accounts of battles of the first Arab conquest. However, those accounts normally responded to certain practical purposes of the time, like documenting who had participated to a certain battle and was therefore entitled to certain rewards and benefit. They provided lists of names of people and anecdotes about specific individuals, but they lack the inquisitive spirit that make classical Greek and Roman historiography so fascinating and useful for us. There is no tension towards explanation of things, because the outcome of battles and the destiny of peoples and states are, of course, in the hands of God, and his designs are totally inscrutable. The culture of the ancient Berber was also an oral one, of course, and even more than that of the Arabs, and unfortunately their voices cannot reach us anymore. Of the ancient Berbers said something several centuries later, people belonging to a different civilization, that which had put an end to the Berber one. Thus we know very little about the Berber society. We do not even know the name of the kingdom of Kusila, nor who were the gods of the prophetess, nor what was the name of the Neo-Latin language of Africa. These are just a few examples of the many unanswered questions about the ancient Berbers and their society. After these last words for the defeated, you have certainly noticed, my dear subscribers, that we have now entered into the 8th century. We had entered into the 7th century with lecture 6, a long time ago actually. However, our journey through the Middle Ages has just started. Thank you, as always, for your interest, and see you soon. A presto.